Welcome back, everyone. This has been a truly amazing day here at the CEPR Economic Summit, packed with a lot of information and insight. We still have one more session to go. For the next hour, we're going to take a wide-angle view of the government response during the pandemic. Our panelists will cover its response to the pandemic and its mechanisms and systems for delivering benefits. They'll also talk about the lessons learned that can be applied in the event of another similar crisis and give us a sense of where we are 2 years into the pandemic and where things are headed in the months ahead. We're incredibly lucky to have Jim Tankersley as our moderator for this session. Jim's name is likely familiar to many, as it is often on the front page of the New York Times, where he is a White House correspondent focusing on economic policy. For more than a decade, he's covered politics and economics in Washington, D.C., writing extensively about the stagnation of the American middle class and the decline of economic opportunity in wide swaths of the country. Jim was previously the policy and politics editor at Vox, and before that, an economics reporter for the Washington Post. He covered the 2008 presidential campaign for the Chicago Tribune and began his career working for the Oregonian, the Rocky Mountain News, and the Toledo Blade. He and a Blade colleague won the 2007 Livingston Award for Young Journalists for a series of stories exploring how and why the Ohio economy declined so dramatically over the course of a generation. He's the author of The Riches of This Land, The Untold True Story of America's Middle Class, which was published just around the time Jim was with us on campus as one of CEPR's media fellows. Jim, I'm so happy that you're back with us today, and I'm going to turn things over to you. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's great to be back virtually at my alma mater and moderating just a spectacular panel with three people who are not just incredibly smart, but incredibly nice people and have all been very generous to me in the course of my economics reporting career. And I will quickly introduce them, but then we'll get more into who they are and what they do as we ask them questions. But Kevin Hassett is currently the Vice President and Managing Director of the Lindsay Group. He's a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and CNN economics commentator. He was the 29th chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors under President Trump. And long ago, he spent a lot of time in his office at AEI, helping to explain his work on how corporate taxation and a cut in the corporate tax rate can help the middle class to a young economics reporter in Washington, which is me. And I am forever grateful for that and many other things that Kevin has done. Melissa Carney is also someone who spent a lot of time explaining economics and family economics, in particular inequality, to me and to a lot of other reporters who she's been just a wonderful resource for. She's a professor at the University of Maryland and the director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. She has all sorts of great research that is frequently cited in the press. And Peter Orzag is a former director of a bunch of things you've heard of in Washington, including the Office of Management and Budget under President Obama, and the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, where, and you probably don't remember this, Peter, he spent a good afternoon explaining healthcare policy and other federal spending issues to me way back, even before I was an economics reporter covering Congress at the Chicago Tribune. Peter is now CEO of Financial Advisory at Lazard, Frere & Co., and leads the firm's advisory business that serve companies and governments around the globe. So this is a great panel, and we have a great topic talking about fiscal policy and what's going on. And I'm going to start with Kevin, because you were most recently in the government, and with a very open-ended question, which is we have a large federal deficit, which is coming down after a massive federal response to the pandemic. There are suggestions in Washington right now that policy should be getting much tighter. Democrats, Joe Manchin is pushing for deficit reduction, in fact, right now by raising taxes. And I'm just curious what you think right now, Kevin, is the stance of fiscal policy. Is it appropriate or should it be different, and why? Also, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. It's like old man disease, maybe old person disease, but I always muted. The people like me better muted, it turns out, actually. So it's a great question. It's an honor to be here with you, Jim. We've been at events here at Stanford quite a bit. It's really sad that I'm here and you're not. And it's even sadder that there's a CEPR event and I'm at Hoover and it's right over there, but I'm doing it from my office at Hoover right now. And hopefully soon we'll all be able to get together and sit on the stage together again. I think that for sure that policymakers responded in an underappreciated and positive bipartisan way to the economic challenges of the COVID crisis. And I think that, when the economic historians look back, that they're going to be like super impressed that in the first year when, basically we had 15 days to stop the spread that turned into maybe in the end, you could say it was kind of like 45 days to stop the spread. And so you shut an economy off, for more than a month. It gave us a minus 32% second quarter, that somehow policymakers were able to, come up with policies that kept that from turning into a financial crisis and a depression. And so that required a heck of a lot of policy. It wasn't exactly the way I wanted. Jim, you remember we were talking at that time that I was, at the White House helping to design the PPP, and I was arguing with everybody about how to structure the unemployment insurance plus up. In the end, I advised Republicans and the president to sign off on the $600 that became pretty unpopular because I figured, well, if the economy's shut, you're not going to cost anyone their job because they're not going to avoid going to work because you already told them they can't go to work. So if you're giving them a little too much money right now, that's not a problem. And so all of that stuff means that we ended up pushing government spending to sort of 1943 levels as a share of GDP, something about like that. Eyeballing my chart at Fred, which is a great online place to look at data. And so for sure, government spending is going to come down from there. And then the question is, what's the pace of that? Is it fast enough to solve deficit concerns, reduce inflationary pressures, and so on? And right now, I would say that the trajectory looks pretty sharp, and you don't have to be like a radical Keynesian to think that if you lop 6% of GDP off of government spending over a short period, that could have negative growth effects. I'm not sure that if I were in the White House advising everybody, I would say that the pace needs to, especially in the short run with the uncertainty over Ukraine and so on, accelerate. So I think that, yes, there's going to be a lot of reduced spending. There's going to be deficit reduction, and it's probably at about the maximum pace that one would want to engage in without, putting the recovery at risk.
Thanks so much, Peter. I want to just piggyback off that very quickly for sort of a global perspective. I mean, you were telling us before we started that you've been traveling for work around the world, and I'm just wondering, what's your impression of how U.S. fiscal policy is playing into the global recovery right now, and what role it has to play as the economy confronts the headwinds of higher energy prices and everything else happening from the Ukrainian situation?
Well, let me echo Kevin. I think we do need to kind of get on a curve here and say that fiscal policy, frankly, across most of the industrialized world, but especially in the US and to some degree the UK, and then to a somewhat lesser degree, but still on the continent, was remarkable in the sense that let's just step back to, the first onset of the pandemic. This could have turned out much, 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 much worse by a lot. And the fact that policymakers acted so aggressively, disproportionately aggressively in the US, but pretty aggressively across the board in most of the industrialized world, made a massive difference in people's lives. And you can see that not only from the growth numbers that ultimately did kick in once we got past the worst of the downturn, but from lots of indirect indicators. One example, it was projected early on that somewhere between 3 and 9 million Americans would lose their health insurance because of the economic downturn and losing their jobs and what have you. The fact of the matter is that didn't happen. So there are 3 to 9 million people who maintain health insurance during a health crisis. You might think that would be an important thing to keep during that time. And that is directly because of the expanded FMAP and other steps that were taken to provide support in the United States to maintain that kind of coverage. So that's one small example. There are many, many to come. I'm sure I'm kind of leading into a controversial question, but I think it's interesting that there's been this robust response across the world that I'm sure we'll get to inflation later, but that the narrative that the US stimulus was solely and exclusively responsible for US inflation, I think doesn't stand water when you look across countries. And so maybe we'll come back to that. But then you also asked about what about where we are now as opposed to what we've done. And I would agree with Kevin. Look, if you look at the fiscal drag, either according to the Hutchins Center or the BlackRock numbers on fiscal impulse, we are taking something like 2 to 3 percentage points off of growth because of the fiscal contraction that's happening. And I don't know that you'd want to be taking much more than that. So your direct question is, should we be going faster on the fiscal consolidation? And I would say no.
That's great. Thanks so much. Okay, Melissa, because you're third, you get 2 questions, and then we're going to open it up to a scrum, including a bunch of inflation discussion. But first, can you look a little bit backwards for us and tell us, I mean, we spent a ton of money, and the aggregate amount obviously makes, a big difference as to what happened. But what was good and bad about the spending we had from fiscal policy during the pandemic?
Yeah, I'll start by putting my voice in the chorus to just say the sort of swift and really unprecedentedly large response of Congress was tremendous and revealed itself to be a tremendous success. So that was a great thing that we responded so quickly. It was necessary to make, to just make snap judgments as people were drinking from the fire hose. And as Kevin alluded to, okay, a top up of $600 on unemployment insurance, nobody would optimally design it that way, but we had to get money out quickly. And these kinds of things were a really smart thing to do early on. Kevin also mentioned the Paycheck Protection Program, which was a tremendous program that, really got a lot of money out to businesses and helped them survive the worst of the pandemic. So all of that was terrific. I think, it's worth then saying, did we sustain some of the spending for too long? I'm not going to say that, the additional 1.9 trillion in 2021 was the cause of inflation, as Peter suggested, some might say. I'm not going to say that, but it is a question as to why, when aggregate demand was back up, when the problem we were facing a year after this onset of the pandemic looked like it was sluggish labor supply as opposed to sluggish demand. When, again, to the credit of the early spending, household balance sheets were strong. We actually had a savings overhang. Why then did we spend another $1.9 trillion in fairly untargeted spending? I think that's worth asking. I think that probably wasn't a good idea. There's ways it was probably counterproductive. But even if it wasn't explicitly counterproductive in the sense of maybe it didn't contribute too much to inflation that was about to result, maybe it wasn't the primary cause of labor supply sluggishness, it was not very well spent money. And I think the shame is, I do think we have a lot of federal spending that we could be undertaking now, some of which was proposed in the Build Back Better. But we had just spent all of this money in I think, maybe counterproductive ways, but if not that, probably ways that didn't have high social return. So I think that probably wasn't good and is worth us drawing lessons from.
Can we talk about? Can we talk about social return for the second question, and then you can hit that point, which is just. Obviously, we did not emerge from the pandemic totally unscathed. There were a lot of social problems that resulted in the aftermath, inequality exacerbated in certain ways. Can you talk a bit about the ways that policy failed and what fiscal policy should do now to make up for that?
Yeah, great. So let me start with, again, one thing that we did really well, but I think it also highlights something we failed on. So Peter mentioned millions of people we thought might lose their health insurance and didn't. I'll also mention, many of us really worried that poverty was going to spike, and it didn't. So we did a really good job of preventing poverty from increasing. Congress also did a really, smart move, authorizing expansions in SNAP, pandemic EBTs to make sure that kids who weren't getting school at food didn't go hungry. So there was a lot of things we did to protect the most vulnerable in that sense. But I think that highlights also what we didn't do to protect the most vulnerable. And here, just indulge me a quick rant about how children were completely deprioritized during this pandemic. You know, we learned pretty early on that COVID, you know, mercifully really tended to spare children. They were not at as severe risk, not nearly as severe risk as the elderly, not the same level of risk as the adults or even teenagers. And yet we did not prioritize getting kids back to school in any meaningful way. And I think that is going to be one of the biggest policy failures of this pandemic era. It's going to have one of the longest lasting scarring effects. I realize that schooling decisions are made at the local level in this country, but the federal government could have done way more to make sure that schools were in a position and felt political pressure to get open safely by September 2021. In September 2021, only a quarter of kids in this country were back in school full time. A year after the pandemic, March 2021, you know, only half of kids in this country were back in school. I mean, my daughter living here in Maryland being one of them. She had 24 days of school last year in person. My daughter's going to be fine, but it heightens the fact that like kids who were really vulnerable, who really needed to be in school, they weren't in massive numbers. And that I think is the biggest policy failure in the way we didn't protect vulnerable populations during the pandemic.
Okay, this is all a great start. So now I want to just open this up to whoever wants to answer and talk or fight amongst yourselves. Feel free to actually disagree on something at some point. I'll try to get you to do it. But I guess I'm very curious if there are things the government is not spending money on right now, or if there are revenues that should be reduced in ways that would be productive to the economy. What would they be? What would be the sort of spending programs or tax cuts that you might prioritize right now if you wanted to use some fiscal policy to help the economy we have right now, especially in light of everything going on in the world?
I guess I'll start. Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Peter. I did think to unmute myself that time. But I think that at some point where we definitely will transition to things that we disagree about. I want to add to Melissa's point about the schools that basically recall I had left the Council of Economic Advisors as chairman and was in the private sector, and the president called me back in late February to be senior advisor in the West Wing and to be in the task force. And, my job was basically to present at the task force meetings, like the economic effects of shutdowns and relay these, costs of being closed. And, it's a deep frustration for me how unresponsive to your concerns that were brought up by a lot of people in the White House at the time, the health professionals were. The epidemiologists are kind of univariate optimizers. And if the 15 days to stop the spread stopped the spread, then they'd have been right. But it turned out it was a much different thing than they thought. And I, looking back at the fights that we had, one of the fights, as an example, that our team specifically had was that we wanted, I was talking to sports league commissioners about trying to get sports leagues open and how do we open up businesses. And one of the things that was at the same time, I was talking to guys at Harvard and MIT who were developing tests. And you basically need a lot of tests to get things open safely, especially at the beginning. And the FDA would just not move on tests. And then, really early on, they could mass produce tests that were sort of 70% accurate. And my view was accept it, because 70% of the time someone's going to stay home. And then if you tell them, hey, if it's negative, then don't act as if you have it anyway, or social distance still. But they, had this really, really high standard for tests that they would accept it. And it led to all these things. The failure of those health guys led to all these things, like everything being closed for so long because we didn't mass produce tests until a lot later. And so when Jim just asked things that you're frustrated about, I was thrilled at the bipartisanship, that the White House worked really closely. I practically lived in the Senate Finance Committee room at times, and that was great. But the sort of health professionals who are getting, think about it, at the corner of NIH that's supposed to help us with pandemics is getting $14 billion a year for decades. And then we have a pandemic and their answer is we should all hide in our basements. We could have got that answer without spending the $500 billion. And those kind of failures are something that I really hope the Biden administration studies in a nonpartisan way. I know not that they're being partisan, but we should all support the study of that, because you're right that the kids were the ones that were probably most harmed by this. I think that a twist of your question, Jim, might just be to sort of say, if I were in the White House right now, and I had my old job, say, and of course, there's an extremely talented economist there now, CC Rouse. Then what would I recommend we do because of the state that we're in? And clearly, the Fed is starting a tightening cycle because they've decided that inflation is higher than their target. It's year over year at 7%. I think over the last few months, it might even be running, depending on how much you like the producer price index, at 10%. So it's really high inflation. And the history of inflation is that if you look at charts, like basically inflation rates don't tend to go down until the interest rate's above the inflation rate. There's no way the Fed's going to lift the interest rate above the inflation rate right now. And so the fiscal policy needs to help with the problem. And we're fortunate enough that we have we've got quite a bit of healthy growth, although GDP now for the first quarter is a little scary. But what I would be saying is, and this goes back to something Peter and I have been talking about since like the late 90s, maybe, Peter, that we need a fiscal consolidation. We basically, it's time to fix the entitlements in a bipartisan way, create, like in present value, a massive savings in the long run debt budget situation, so that people have a great deal of faith in the debt situation, the long run debt trajectory of the United States. And then at the same time that we do that, we need to think about things that we could do to increase supply. Because demand was fed by all this cash, supply was constrained by the disease. People maybe learned to stay home more than we would like, and it's going to be hard to get the labor supply back. We need to have supply-friendly policies. And you can't just have a tax cut that is sort of going to pay for itself, especially now, given what's happened to deficits. You need to combine it with some kind of like long-run fiscal retrenchment. And so fiscal consolidations are what countries on the ropes tend to do when they find themselves in a situation like the one that we're in now. And it'd be great if we could get to one without having a crisis first.
So Jim, I guess I'll jump in. First, a quick comment on schools just with regard to additional spending, because I think there is one pretty simple thing that will help a lot, whether it's COVID or non-COVID, which is to invest in the air filtration, even if it's a portable device. The one thing, back to Melissa's point, that we could have done in addition to emphasizing the importance of masking to make going back to school safer for everyone, including the teachers who are often a crucial obstacle, was to put one of these devices in every schoolroom. Sure, it would cost money, but relative to the lost human capital and the disruption to lives that resulted, it's a small price to pay. So we could still do that. And too many of our schools are not, having a window open during the middle of the winter is not a good solution. There are alternatives. So that's the first point. Second point is, the only thing, honestly, that I would be in favor of spending a lot of extra money on at this point is the energy transition. I think climate risk dominates fiscal risk by a wide margin. And I'm in favor of pretty much anything that, passes a simple might it help test on that. We can go into some of the details, but a big category, only part of which was in Build Back Better, and there was a lot of other stuff that was in that legislation, but I would focus on energy transition as being a key part of federal spending, from R&D on to lots of other dimensions. And then finally, I'd say, if we're thinking about the stance of fiscal policy, I'm going to go back to a paper for the Peterson Institute that Bob Rubin and Joe Stiglitz and I wrote about a year ago, which highlighted several things that we should be doing, all of which still hold. The first is that we should be expanding the automatic stabilizers so that things kick in when the economy has a downturn. Unemployment insurance is a great example, but back to Melissa's point about the amount of spending that was delivered at the wrong time. The more that you have the automatic stabilizers in place, the less you have to worry about that, because they kick in automatically, and importantly, they turn off automatically as the economy recovers. And we've been talking about this for a while, but haven't done very much in terms of moving in that direction. So that's a big thing. Second thing is, I personally would favor, it's a little less advantageous now, but it's still advantageous, lengthening the maturity structure of government debt to lock in pretty low interest rates while they're here. They may not be here forever. I think we've fallen into a false complacency about what might or might not happen. And there's an insurance aspect to the federal government in terms of being able to lock in the rates today. And we could talk about that. It's a little bit complicated given the interaction with the Fed, but on net, I think it's still a good thing. And then finally, I think we should be building in a lot more things that over the long term, and this gets to part of Kevin's point, over the long term, automatically adjust our long-term entitlement programs for the underlying drivers of their costs. So a great example is to index Social Security benefits to longevity so that the present value of the benefit doesn't just go up lockstep as life expectancy expands. This is something that Peter Diamond and I had proposed a long time ago, and I still think it's a good idea. That's one of many examples, but the benefit of that is you kind of put a foam on the runway to make it easier to adjust in the future if you need to. I have no concern that future Congresses will be able to undo future fiscal restraint if we build it in gradually over time. I think it's reasonable to expect the opposite. And then of course the critique is, well, they won't stick with it. And the counterexample to that is something called the normal retirement age under Social Security. There's been zero debate about the increases in the normal retirement age, or not zero, but almost zero debate about the increases in normal retirement age that have gone into place over the past few years without anyone noticing, even though they were enacted in 1983. And that's what I'm talking about, is if you do things with a lag and gradually, you can kind of tilt these long-term entitlement programs towards fiscal balance in a way that if you needed to undo in the future, you could, but that are credible to do as long as they're gradual and extended over time.
Melissa, I have a couple. I want to ask your thought on this, but I would just like very quickly point of personal privilege to say, Peter's answer is exactly like one of the things that journalists absolutely are jealous of people in economics about. Like if my editor ever asked me a question and I said, I'd like to refer you to my story from a year ago because I think the answer still holds. I've tried it. It doesn't work.
It's very helpful. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that paper.
But I do remember the paper. Yes, I also
paper.
remember the paper. So yeah, thank you, Peter. Anyway, Melissa,
Yeah.
I know there are things that you think are worthwhile investments right now, and I'm curious, what are they, and do they need to be paid for, and or overpaid for, underpaid? Like, how would you think about that fiscally?
Yeah. So right. So I think there are things we should pay for that are worth paying for. I do think spending that we commit to going forward should be paid for. I'm glad Peter raised the issue of entitlement reform. There are ways that we can get there are ways we could shift money around in our current budget. There are also ways we could raise new revenue. And I would, even within the existing income tax code, even, we've been talking in this country about expanding the capacity of the IRS to actually collect the taxes that the government's owed in the tax code. So there are ways we could raise revenue that would not hinder growth. There are ways we could reform entitlement to free up some discretionary spending for other priorities. And I think fundamentally, again, this is like, Peter, let's go back to things we said even before the pandemic. I would argue then, and I'll still argue now, we should pay for things that have a positive return. We should think about things in an investment framework and in a cost benefit framework. And, I love that Peter brought up the energy transition. I think investing in our in our energy infrastructure and our climate mitigation strategies, these are all forward-looking spending commitments that we should prioritize. In the same way, we should be prioritizing spending that enhances the human capital productivity of our country. And let me go back to my theme. We don't spend enough on kids. So let's, Peter brought up long-term entitlement reform. I didn't. We spend massive amounts of money in Social Security and Medicare taking care of the elderly in this country. We have no promise of social insurance to kids in this country. It was exciting that for a moment we were talking about a non-refundable expanded child tax credit potentially being permanent. This was something where, the country was focused attention on, hey, how do we take care of poor kids in this country? And this is not just consumption giveaway. This is part of investing in our future. Frankly, the same way we invest in our physical infrastructure, we have to invest in in our people and our kids that are going to be the workforce of tomorrow. I would like to see that debate about the expanded child tax credit or a monthly child allowance. I would like to see that resurfaced. I think there are obvious ways to politically compromise on that should not be dead. Okay, so it was a massive expansion. It covered 90% of kids in this country. It was fully refundable. We could target it. It doesn't have to go up to 400, families making 400,000. We could make it partially refundable, but having real income maintenance to families with kids is something this country should commit to and would be in line with all of the spending that we've talked about that would be investments in our future. And again, I think it's worth paying for, and there are ways we could pay for it.
I did the Kevin thing. I can't believe it. We're now half an hour into the panel, and we haven't really talked about inflation yet. So let's just talk a lot about inflation. It's obviously the thing hanging over all of fiscal policy right now. So anybody can take it. First off, how much does fiscal policy, particularly the Biden rescue plan, have to bear? How much blame does it bear for the inflation we have now? And does fiscal policy have a role in trying to bring it down? How worried are we about it without a fiscal policy response to it?
I guess I'll jump in. As you know, there are basically two narratives on what is causing U.S. inflation. The first is they overdid it with this big stimulus. Demand, expanded too rapidly, and that caused inflation. The second is we're in the middle of a pandemic. There was a massive shift from away from services consumption towards goods consumption, and that caused a whole variety of different pressures as a result. My own opinion is that the cross-country comparisons are informative here. And I think the conclusion is the one that Melissa noted, which is that the stimulus or the pandemic relief programs have played some role, but they're not the major explanation for why the US inflation rate is where it is. And I think it's as simple as looking at the inflation rates abroad, noting that they've also gone up very significantly, not quite as much as the US. And maybe you can attribute the delta to the additional fiscal support that we provided here. Even when you do so, there are some potential offsetting benefits, some of which we have discussed. But I think it is really informative to look across the world and just quickly to note that there are differences. More of European inflation, the headline inflation at least, comes from energy and food than in the US. So that sort of cuts against what I was just saying. On the other hand, I do think some of the analyses that have been done have not properly taken into account the outsized role that used and new car prices have played in the US. Europeans with more dense populations don't have as high demand for automobiles. That's a pretty big deal. And so when you sort through it all, bottom line is inflation's up across the world. I think it's too much of a stretch to argue that the US pandemic relief programs caused global inflation. And therefore I come to the basic conclusion that Melissa did, which is it's not irrelevant, but it's not the primary driver.
Melissa, do you want to go second this time? And I don't want to keep going.
Sure. So let me first make sure I put the disclaimer that I am not a monetary economist, nor do I want to play one on this panel, but I think we are going to have to turn to monetary policy to rein in inflation. I'd be curious to what my co-panelists would say about whether monetary policy was too loose for too long in the US and that contributed to it. And I don't know, can I as a panelist ask a question back to Peter, how the cross-country comparisons shed light on that question? But, we always worry about what sort of tightening monetary policy is going to do to the economic environment and the possibility of stimulating the next recession. And recent geopolitical events, I think, make this all a more challenging environment for the Fed and monetary policy.
Yeah, I think that Peter's right that looking at the delta is probably the best way to estimate this effect. I was kind of a little, Jim, you probably remember this. So I was a little surprised one morning, really early on, like almost the first time that President Biden spoke from the Oval Office. He mentioned me by name. I don't know if you remember this, because at the time that they were there, and this is something that Peter remembers too. That being in the White House at a very difficult time. Peter, you were there through some really difficult times, and so that while they're happening, it's very hard to figure out exactly what you're supposed to do. You do your best. And at the time that they designed the stimulus in January, remember cases had skyrocketed in COVID cases, and there was like a serious risk that was going to be as disruptive as it had been in the previous year, and that we were once again going to be into a place where we needed to have new PPP and all sorts of like really aggressive stuff. Fortunately, the cases turned around relatively quickly. And I think that if I were to say that there was a policy error, given that, I didn't support the size of the bill that they had, but President Biden quoted me saying, I think we need to do something again. And it was because the cases were so high at that time. The cases dropped sharply by the time the bill passed, and they didn't change the number. And I understand how politics works and so on, but I think that I think they spent too much. And coming up with an economic model that maps that to inflation, you're definitely going to say that it added to inflation. But Peter's right that inflation's higher around the rest of the world. On the monetary side, during the COVID crisis, it's actually something I was going to call your colleague Nick, who has a new book out about, or your former colleague Nick, Timarios, that I was talking to the Fed folks almost every day during this thing, and I kind of saw what they were doing. And I think in retrospect, that they also were in the difficult situation trying to stop depression because we were having the second quarter that was minus 30-something%. But that what happened both with the Trump stimulus and with the Biden stimulus is that it was different than earlier versions of quantitative easing. And I know this is not a monetary panel, so I'll go really, really fast. But quantitative easing in the past was kind of like you buy a bond from Citigroup, and then you get the bond, and then the Fed goes to Citigroup's reserve account, and they turn the knob up and say, oh, they got extra money in their reserve account, and oh, by the way, we ask you not to use your reserves, or for some reason, we'll pay you interest not to use your reserves. But the money was kind of extinguished by going into the basement of the Fed into the reserve account and not going out into the economy. And if you want to Google, our reserves money, then you can find articles on this. It's like reserves are not money. What happened during both the sort of the Trump era and the Biden era stimuli is that instead of giving the money to Citi and throwing it in a reserve account, you could think of the money as going to the Treasury, and they mailed it to people and told them to spend it. And so the reserves, if you like, became money, and so. It's not really a helicopter drop. Like at a Milton Friedman helicopter drop, you don't have to pay the money back because the helicopter dropped you the money, and thank God it did that. And it's wonderful. But here, the money dropped, and people were going to have to pay it back in the future. But it's fundamentally different from early versions of QE. And if you wonder why we have inflation and why they have inflation abroad, I think that it's sort of understanding how reserves turn into money is a crucial factor. But a crucial reason that they did is that basically we were mailing checks to people and financing it with Fed borrowing.
I guess what I would say about monetary policy, just since we're on that momentarily, is I think it sort of was implied by Melissa. At this point, it does look like they've been too slow. I mean, inflation is higher than people would like. But I don't think that's the right question. The right question is, at the time and leading up to this, where we are now, was it a reasonable bet for monetary policymakers to tilt towards looseness in order to protect against the downside risks to the economy in a massively uncertain situation? And my own opinion is that was a reasonable bet. It turned out not to pay off. Bets don't always pay off, but that's not the right way to think about it. And in an alternative universe where the economy weakened unexpectedly and they had tightened prematurely, I think the consequences of that would have been worse than the problem that we face today.
I mean, that was certainly something that you heard a lot from the Biden folks talking about the fiscal response a year ago was, we don't want to make the same mistake that we think policymakers, no offense, Peter, made in the Great Recession aftermath. We'd rather go too big than go not big enough at all. And so I'm curious, Peter and everybody else, do you think that they erred on the right side there?
I'm going to go back to something Melissa said, which is that I think the problem here is not the size. I also don't think the problem in 2009 was the size. It was the duration and sort of the time profile. So going back to the previous debate, the problem was not the amount of fiscal stimulus delivered in the third quarter of 2009. The problem was how little was delivered in, the third quarter of 2011. And that comes back to this automatic stabilizer point, which is if they had done 1.9 trillion in expectation, but in the form of basically a massive amount of automatic stabilizers, then as the economy recovered, it would have turned out to have been a lot less. And that's fine. So I think it's less this focus on the amount is a little bit off. It's more about the time profile and in particular, whether the time profile can adjust to the state of the economy. Basically, what I would say is ex post, it was too much after the fact. But the big error, and there was discussion about it at the time, was it's always easy. And I've been in the room. I understand it's never easy in the room to get a structural change, to say, let's tie this to the unemployment rate or to the share of the population with a job or whatever, because it's always easier to just get it done, boom, 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 boom. But we did lose an opportunity here to have done that at the time. And I view that as the kind of the bigger error, if you will, because it's very easy to second guess the size and what have you. But you can't second guess the preference to tie it to the state of the economy, because I don't understand the counter argument.
Anyone else have thoughts on that, or should we move on to other sharp questions before we go to the audience? Kevin,
I'll just respond to Peter that I thought that he was a real voice of reason during that time. He might remember that I was about the only guy that was ever allowed to testify against the Obama stimulus plan. I have a lot of testimony that's on the record at the time, and I was saying something that I believe as an economist is true, but is like politically, having been at a White House now, especially kind of crazy, but quite consistent with what I'm saying now, which is that I think that the idea, I can remember Larry Summers said at the time that it needs to be targeted and timely, and there were 3 T's, right? And my view was and temporary. That was the other one. And my view was that the policy error that the Obama administration made, and certainly Republicans made by not working to try to move them in this direction, was just that a crisis should be a time when you fix big things that are broken. And so in my testimony, House Budget Committee, the first hearing, Doug Elmendorf's first as CBO chair, if I remember. But back then, I was basically arguing that they should have a fiscal consolidation and then use a share of the long run savings to fund a big stimulus. And I think that, and I was even willing to go bigger than you guys, Peter, if you remember. I'm sure you remember our debates about that. You came over kindly to AEI at one point while you're there, and so I think that that's kind of what I'm saying we need to do now. Although we don't necessarily need more stimulus, but fiscal consolidation is almost like a gift that since our long run entitlements are broken, and since Peter has a great plan to fix them, and other people have great plans to fix them, that if we fix them, then it gives you surplus that you can use to fix other things, and also restores confidence in the long run health of the fiscal situation in the country. And so I think the error I would say that the Obama administration made is they didn't do that, but it's fair to say, okay, ivory tower economist guy, you don't understand politics. Putting entitlements on the table in the middle of a recession means it's going to come way too late, and you're probably going to fail. And I'm sure that that's probably the reason why voices like Peter, you were talking about entitlements long before you went into the White House, that you didn't say, hey, let's do my great idea that Peter Diamond and I invented right now. And you probably did that because there's no way they could get it done in time.
So we're going to go to audience questions here in just a second. And thanks everybody who got to admit. If you have a question, please feel free to drop it in right now as Melissa takes my final question here, because we haven't heard from you in a little bit. But I'd like you to sort of step back and just for a second try to think, not like an economist, but like a real person, and talk more about because you opened talking about a more of a human consequence of policy here. And I'm wondering how much of what we've seen, whether it's inflation, whether it's the response of people, is not just born of fiscal policy that's happened, but massive social changes that have come from this pandemic that have not unwound, whether it's a shift in how people spend money from services to goods, or a shift in what type of work people are willing to do, or where they want to live. How much of sort of lasting social change do you think is going to happen, and will that affect sort of the way we need to think about fiscal policy?
Oh, well, now, I mean, it's dangerous. You've asked me to just think like a person and not an economist. I don't have a clear model in my head, but like everybody else, I'm looking around, and I like to be optimistic that some of the good things that happened in the past 2 years stayed with us, right? A lot of people had the opportunity to reevaluate what was important to them and what they wanted out of life. We're seeing that a little bit in some of the churning in the labor market, in the movement of people around the country. I think that's a good thing, and hopefully it'll yield greater human flourishing and happiness. As an economist, I look at the shifting of people around the country and some of the movements outside of cities, and I get optimistic that maybe some of the regional divergence that we've had in economic prosperity across places, with some superstar cities taking all and other cities, other parts of the country not doing as well. Maybe this pandemic will have inadvertently launched a bit more convergence if people can work from different places. So that's a positive thing that'll come out of it. You've written about this in your news stories, the tremendous burden that the pandemic and the changes in work and school and all that placed on working parents, mothers in particular, how that's going to shake out in terms of, long-term changes in bargaining between workers and employers, bargaining within the household, women, mothers, parents being at a long-term sort of disadvantage because of the shock, the hit that their work took during this pandemic. That's another trend that I think relates to the social trends and also has real economic implications. Great.
Well, thank you so much. And first off, before we go to the audience questions, you guys are just a spectacular panel. This is super fun. And we have some good questions from the audience. And so we've got a few minutes to answer them. We'll start, as you often do, with a question about the Black Plague. Do you think the current pandemic will ultimately result in a reduction of income inequality between the top 5% and the middle class in America? After the Black Plague pandemic of the 14th century, the serfs became middle class. Will history repeat? Anybody want to take that?
I'll take a crack at that because I believe there's a Stanford historian, and I'm unfortunately blanking on his name, but that has written a book about the great levelizing effects of truly terrible things, Black Plagues and wars and what have you. And I do think there is a trend towards depolarization politically and reduced inequality that follows truly catastrophic events. But that same Stanford historian was quoted in one of the news.
Maybe you're referencing this book, Peter. It happens.
No, not that one. No,
Okay.
not that one. No, different one. No. But thank you. Yes, also Stanford, right? Basically, I think the point is this as terrible as it wasn't bad enough to trigger those sorts of consequences, in part because we acted so well for several reasons. First, we haven't talked about this, but the scientific achievement of getting mRNA vaccines out as rapidly as we did, which in itself is a reflection of the venture and capital and other backing to develop that technology over an arduous several decade journey, is amazing. That's the first point. But secondly, what we've been talking about blunted the effect. So in the Black Plague, there was no pandemic relief package that government supported, and that's a much different. So the consequences, I think, will probably be different than in the past. I think the sort of tendency is correct that catastrophic events often have this kind of levelizing effect. But in part because of the science and in part because of the aggressive government action, I suspect that this time won't be the same as those historical episodes.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Melissa, if I cut you off, but there, just in today's jobs report, there was like an interesting pattern, Peter, where you probably noticed this too, that like basically wages at the bottom are going up pretty sharply, but supervisors are seeing like no wage increases at all. And it's kind of, I've spent the day noodling over whether if that pattern persists, why it's happening, and I'm not sure. It's got to be related to the pandemic somehow, but it could be if that were to continue, that the person's question would be answered in the affirmative.
So Jim, if we have time, I don't have something directly on this, but the mention of the Black Plague and Peter's point that the government response really blunted the bad things from happening. I'll just raise an issue that hasn't come up. But one thing that I really expected at the beginning was a huge fertility bust, a COVID baby bust, and that's potentially, I mean, consequential because we already have a huge decline in birth rates in this US that show no signs of turning around. And I was wondering and worrying how much this was going to amplify that. And part of my thinking on that was drawn from the response of birth rates to previous recessions and the tremendous decrease in births associated with the Spanish flu. And that's really interesting. If you look at the Spanish flu, like birth rates 9 months after each of the spikes really fell. And that was at a time where there wasn't an economic crisis and there wasn't modern contraceptive technology, but people still refrained from getting pregnant. But it turned out that after the first few months of the pandemic, when conceptions resulting in births were down, household spending went back up and people's rates of, conceiving babies, that returned to normal too. So that was another interesting sort of like big societal shift that I was expecting, but the blunting of the effect of the crisis really seemed to forestall that as well.
That is a fantastic interplay between real person things and economist things, Melissa. Thank you.
And Jim, can I just jump back in for a second?
Yes, please, Peter.
Apologize to Professor Walter Scheidel. That was the Stanford, since he's a Stanford historian. So my apologies, Professor.
And you are on paternity leave right now, Jim. So you're.
Yeah, no, I am. My wife and I are, and our daughter are living proof that Melissa's theory was wrong. But okay, back to a couple more audience questions. Kevin, I think it'd be great if you started with this one, since you were in the room most directly. I assume there was some kind of cost-benefit analysis of shutting down the economy that was done in early 2020. What were the estimates of the costs and the benefits, and were they accurate in hindsight?
Yeah, it was one of the reasons I think that I got called back in. Jim, you know the story, but I was literally in the outback in Australia where the president said, we need someone in the West Wing back here. He brought me back a senior advisor to help us look at like the costs and benefits of the policies that we're pursuing. I'm sorry, someone just knocked on my door. I should have put a do not disturb on it. I made a presentation at one of the first task force meetings that I attended in early March, where I put out an estimate, which I probably talked to you about at the same time, Jim, that I thought second quarter GDP was going to drop more than 30%. And I was saying that on TV as soon as I got back into the White House. And I think that one of the reasons why Drs. Birx and Fauci, who I work very closely with every day, understood that they needed to put together a plan to open up the economy or to guide governors to opening up the economy. You might remember they had this PowerPoint presentation that they made, was that, after I got back, then the task force meeting started to include discussions of the costs as well. And so like a specific cost benefit analysis like Peter used to oversee at the OMB that would have been impossible to perform, where you say, oh, you gain this much for this much policy, but the cost of the benefits of all the policies started to be on the table kind of right after I got back there. Before I was there, it was the task force was only healthcare people.
Peter, Melissa, did either of you have thoughts on sort of the way you were thinking about it at the time and the way it's borne out?
I don't have any.
All right.
No from both of us.
Right. Great. All right. So moving on. Melissa, this is directly to you. In response to your comment that we don't spend enough on kids, would it be more accurate to say that we do, but we don't spend it very wisely or effectively? And if so, how can we better allocate and make sure we get the outcomes we seek?
Okay, so that's a really good question. I actually think we don't spend enough. So a lot of our programs that would ameliorate sort of the material deprivation or gaps in kids' outcomes, they are not entitlement programs, right? So for example, childcare subsidies, way oversubscribed. Housing vouchers for families, way oversubscribed. Head Start, way more kids eligible than there are spots. So there's actually programs that are just have pretty small budgets compared to the number of families and kids who would benefit from them. But I think the question is well posed in that it's not just about spending more money. You have to spend it well. So frankly, on the one hand, I was really excited that the Biden administration and the Build Back Better had, a dedicated attention to spending on kids, like expanded childcare, expanded early childhood education. But then I was frustrated by there didn't seem to be very well thought out prescripted plans. And if we just spend billions of dollars on early childhood education, but it's not scalable, it's not well targeted, it's not high quality, then that would be money not well spent. And so I think it's both. I think we need to spend a lot more on kids and we need to spend it very deliberately.
Peter, how would you have thought of that question at CBO?
So I'd say a couple of things. Obviously, first, at the federal level, it's unambiguously true. When you include state and local spending, it's a little bit, it's still true. It's just a little bit less true than just when you look at the federal government. But if you simply look at the expenditures by age, back to Melissa's point, they are, mostly because of pensions and healthcare, really skewed towards the non-kid part of the population. And if you look at a vast array of literature and evidence on the returns to investing in kids in terms of the present value of the benefits, they're really high. So there is a mismatch. This is something that Melissa, and we had been talking about Bell Salvo before, Bell and others have highlighted. So it is both the amount and the allocation that is an issue here.
We've got one question left and about a minute to go on the panel. And so I'm just going to toss it out there. It's a monetary policy question. With the Fed's current assets having increased to close to $9 trillion, are there major concerns with divesting such high levels of current assets? And if so, well, what are those concerns?
Kevin, do you want to go? Or
no, I can talk about that if you guys want.
Please.
Yeah, I did work at the Fed for a while and help recruit the current Fed chair and stuff and convince the president to vote for him. So I think the monetary policy will have to unwind that $9 trillion or so. And that the Fed, can do that by basically just, letting stuff mature and running it down, and that they're going to be very good at doing that without causing serious market disruptions. But it should show up in the yield curve. I would guess that which should steepen because of it, but it's not going to be like a really big dramatic effect because the Fed understands how to unwind it. And if you're looking for something to Google, then there's a big financial literature on something called block sales. And block sales, it turns out, generally don't have big effects on markets for reasons that economists have been studying for decades. And so the questioner could Google block sales and then let that literature inform their thinking about the Fed's divesting from these bonds.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, I'm going to stop and turn it back over to Mark. But I one more time, just want to thank all three of you for being spectacular and incredibly informative, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks to all four of you for a terrific session. Thanks, Jim, for moderating so expertly, and special thanks to our panelists, Kevin, Melissa, and Peter. We're going to move now to an exclusive session with our CEPR associates, but I also want to thank every one of you who's now watching so much for joining us for this year's Economic Summit. Whether we hold our summit online or in person, putting this event together is no small feat. And I am incredibly, incredibly grateful for the very hard work of the entire staff at CEPR. I'm privileged to work with a very talented and committed team, and I've been incredibly impressed by their dedication, particularly during this very trying time during the last 2 years of the pandemic. And to all of you again, thank you again so much for all of your support. As I said in opening the summit yesterday, our work in addressing and analyzing the biggest economic policy challenges isn't easy, but it is made possible in very, very large part by you and by our entire community. So thank you all. I hope to see you on campus and in person very soon. And I hope you have a fabulous weekend. And for those of you who are joining this other session, I hope to see you over there in a couple minutes. Thanks again, everybody.